Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of The Future Scientist. I'm James G. Barbieri, a program coordinator of the Power Center and host for you today. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call, so feel free to just message me if you have any issues. Let me very briefly go through the guidelines for this call. Firstly, if you can please mute your microphone to avoid any background noise, but we do invite you to turn on your camera. The chat is open throughout the call, so feel free to use it to share your thoughts with the rest of the group. And finally, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and for you all, you should receive the recording in a few days. So today we will have Alex Gómez-Marín in conversation with Jordi Pigem. Jordi is an author and professor with a PhD in philosophy from the University of Barcelona. He devoted his doctoral work to the intercultural thought of the philosopher and theologian Raimon Panikkar, being also the author of the edition and introduction of Raimon Panikkar, Ecosophy, The Wisdom of Earth. He was a professor of philosophy of science at Schumacher College in England and currently teaches several courses in Spanish universities. Alex, you may know by now, is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist and director of the Power Center. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master's in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. Since 2016, he's been the head of the Behavior of Organism Laboratory and at the Instituto de Neurociencia in Alicante, where he's an associate professor at the Spanish Research Council. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, both of you. Welcome, Alex and Jordi.
Thank you so much, James, as always, for introducing us. És realment un plaer, Jordi, tenir-te aquí. Jordi,
thank you, Alex.
Is a very special guest, as everyone we have, but especially he's a Spaniard like me, a Catalan, and so I'm very happy that we have this time to have a conversation together. And I wanted to kick off by asking a difficult question, and we can unfold it, and because you've written about it. So I wanted to ask you, what is post-truth? And this is perhaps an easier question than asking what is truth, but we can talk about all the varieties. Lies, bullshit, and all the different true enough and so on. But I think post-truth is something quite worrisome today. So perhaps we can start with that.
Okay. Well, as you know, post-truth is a new word that appeared about 25 years ago. It links with something that philosopher Hannah Arendt was saying in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she says that the ideal subject of the totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or communist or whatever, but the ideal subject of the totalitarian rule is someone for whom it doesn't matter the distinction between true and false, fact and fiction. And we've entered a world in which more and more the distinction between what is fact and what is fiction doesn't matter. And we have all this power of the media, and we have all this power of the social media in which whoever has more likes seems to be more right. And we come to a world in which what seem to be rock-solid foundations of knowledge, such as science, are more and more, in some areas, in the hands of vested interests and many kinds of sleight of hand ways of sculpting data. And going more specifically into science, one of the most read scientific articles of the 21st century is by John Ioannidis, and the title is something like, Why Most Research Papers Are False. Or, sorry, Why Most Research Findings Are False. He refers particularly to medicine, right? And this is, as I say, one of the most well-read papers in this century. And then last year, 2021, we reached the extreme in which in the British Medical Journal, there was an article published by a former director of this British Medical Journal, which is one of the most prestigious medicine journals in the world, in which he was saying that the corruption, I suppose that's the word, of the research, the publications, and all the structure around medical knowledge is so deep that we should take anything published in a medical journal as false until proven otherwise. This is an amazing statement. when I was studying, what was published in a good scientific journal was obviously true until proven otherwise. It could be that 20 years later you have new data or something appears that shows that the article wasn't right for some reason. But this man, a former director of the British Medical Journal, Richard Smith, was publishing this article in 2021 saying to take the research published in these journals as false until proven otherwise. This is, of course, because in medical journals there is a lot of economic interests, and if your research is in paleontology or on the rings of Saturn or something like this, in which business is in principle not affected, that would be another matter. But we have this, and we have similar declarations in the Lancet, New England Medical Journal, and so on. So post-truth is not a lie. It's just a state of confusion in which it doesn't matter if something is true or is not true. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's even worse, because if you have just truth and falsehood, you only have two players. But when you bring in post-truth, it's just like a smoke screen that clouds your vision, and you don't know who to trust. Mm-hmm. And therefore, this idea that science is the ultimate source of solid knowledge crumbles.
There are many things there. One immediately sees the political dimension of science, which is often ignored by scientists. At least that's my experience. When you talk about science, they may be willing to talk about epistemology. How do we know what we know? Maybe. Metaphysics, no, please, because of what had happened in the 20th century. We don't need to go into that. But the political dimension, no, please. But at the end of the day, we're all scientists and human beings live in a world, and they need to negotiate, and there are these hierarchies of power and tensions. So I wonder, when you say that there's this trend of not caring what truth is, what replaces it? Is it, some people say it's power, and then the twin remark about this is, well, if we don't have truth, or if we don't believe truth is that relevant, who to trust and why, right? The scientists, and the pandemic is an example, have been proclaimed as those who we should trust, but even that very trust is now shaky, because again, it gets entangled with political and economic issues. So what replaces truth if you pretend you got rid of it? Something, some other value, let's say, must emerge and take its role, even if we don't think or we don't see it. What do you think?
Well, and right now, as we can see, what replaces truth is basically chaos, confusion, disorientation, and so on. And obviously, we need to find new ways of reaching truth. Right. And a start is common sense. And obviously, you get to know people that you find reliable, and these people or these authors or whoever you can follow, and you can tell whether they are reliable or they aren't. But at the bottom of all this process, I see something very much related to the history of science, which is that basically 400 years ago, starts the project of modern science. And we could actually say 400 years ago, because there is this key moment for many historians, the dream of Descartes. Descartes had 3 dreams on the night of the 10th of November, 1619, right?
At Ulm, right? Was it at Ulm when Einstein had his dreams?
I don't remember about Einstein's dreams.
I think it's the same city where Einstein had a dream too.
Oh, really? Right.
Ulm? Well, I cannot pronounce it.
Yes, Ulm in Germany.
Amazing,
yes.
Amazing. Okay.
Yes, okay, of course. And Einstein was born there or near there. Yes, of course. Huh. So Descartes has these 3 dreams in 1619, in which he realizes that we need a new foundation for knowledge. And basically from there emerges his method that involves, gaining knowledge by fragmenting everything as much as possible. Exactly the opposite as what David Bohm realized, that we need to see the undivided wholeness of the universe and of all things. So fragmentation, and another big tool is reducing everything to numbers, to mathematics.
Yes.
And by the way, both Descartes and Galileo claim, and they say that explicitly in their writings, that only exists what can be measured. That is, longitude, weight, acceleration is real, whereas colors, smells, feelings, pleasure, pain are just illusions. And this is very peculiar, because what matters in your life is not what can be measured. Descartes goes to the extreme of saying that if a sword cuts your arm, the pain the sword produces doesn't matter. What matters is the angle in which the sword is cutting, the depth of the cut, and so on, which is very interesting for the doctor that is to attend you later. Fine. But of course, the pain also matters, and matters very much. But they sweep away all qualities from experience. And this is part of what gives its power to modern science. So 400 years ago, emerges this method that tries to show all of reality as a machine in mechanical terms, right? Reducible to mathematical laws and so on. Now, if we were to see this 400 years as an experiment in which millions of scientists have taken part, I would say, and I hope you would agree, that this experiment of trying to show that the universe is a machine has failed, because more and more we see in quantum physics, in all kinds of advanced disciplines, in chaos theory and so on, we see that the universe doesn't behave like a mechanism. It's much more complex than what we can find in machines. And that the assumptions that were built into this project of only taking as real what can be measured don't work, because they live outside what matters most in our lives. So I believe there is a relation, a link between the fact that we chose to look only at what can be measured, and we get to a world that is full of abundance in measurable things, in material things, but is very much lacking in meaning in our lives, right? For most people. And to a world that has all these technological prodigies, all these technological wonders, but in many senses is very much lost. And I actually would like to think that Descartes would have been honest enough, if he was born today, he was alive today, I mean, to realize that, hey, this doesn't work. The world is much more than what can be measured. In fact, for me, one of the main implications of quantum physics is that the world is not made of objects, but of relations. Because everything you separate as object, at the end, it doesn't make any sense at the level of quantum physics, or actually relativity physics either, right? So, but we still are focused on a world of objects, and a world of objects is a world that invites control and competition, whereas a world of relations is a world that invites a very different approach to life.
You know, I have a sense that we repeat these, and we're called romantics, or we're called Luddites sometimes, right? Like, well, you just hate machines, or when we point to the techno-capitalist roots, or, you know, that wave that added on top of the project that you're describing that started 400 years ago, we try to say it, and still I have this unease, this sense of not being very optimistic, because look, quantum mechanics was like this big shock to our understanding of the physical world. 100 years later, yes, we talk about it at the Paris Center. Yes, the Nobel Prize has been given to entanglement. Yes, but biologists act as if this never happened, as if they're still living in the 19th century with 21st century machines and technology. And we humans, more or less, behave, well, depending, but we also act as if we were more like machines than angels, which is the title of one of your books. So, but you've been in this business a bit longer than I have. Have you seen a trend of improving, or it's just us repeating those hopefully better truths to the choir, but nothing really? I mean, my experience as a scientist is that these things they're not catching fire. You can go back to Goethe, you know, to you know, this more holistic view, and of course, one could name contemporary people, right? And actually, those are some of the ones that I try to bring here to the Future Scientist and to events we do in Paris. But there's a feeling we're still going to continue with this machine-like mindset for many years, maybe until it's too late, or maybe it's already too late.
Well, when I started getting into these things, say in the late 1980s, is when I started reading Fritjof Capra, David Bohm, Rupert Sheldrake, and so on. There was a sense that there was a kind of new paradigm science, as we are calling it, emerging in all kinds of fields, that was moving towards this more relational, holistic view in all kinds of disciplines. And in those days, you could imagine that now, 2022, we would have a truly holistic science integrating spirituality and giving meaning to lives. But then there was a kind of backlash, partly because the science that serves the interests of techno-capitalism is a science of separating things. For instance, biotechnology, instead of a more holistic biology that would be interested in the shapes of organisms, the form of organisms, has almost disappeared from the biological discourse. What seems to matter only is how to manipulate the biochemistry, right? Mm. So in many fields, partly because of economic pressure, there was this backlash going back to what essentially is a Cartesian paradigm, which, as you were saying, is what nowadays dominates in biology and in neuroscience, and then gets into these conundrums of these clever philosophers and neuroscientists that claim that consciousness doesn't exist. And they claim that from their own consciousness, but they say it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's like as if they were hypnotized. It's amazing. And I've spoken, as I suppose you have, with some of them. And yes, they believe that their immediate experience is just an illusion. Well, if that's an illusion, of course, we're going to get into post-truths, because one of the basics of common sense, as developed in phenomenology, is that you have to start from your own immediate experience. And even Descartes starts from his experience when he develops his method. But then this has come to these extremes of very clever people that believe that existence is an illusion. Well, so there's been this backlash. And yes, nowadays, this more holistic science is a bit on the fringes. And like you would have imagined that Rupert Sheldrake, after the initial reaction against his first books, yes, nowadays he would be recognized as one of the greatest biologists alive, right? And well, no, on the contrary, there are other elements that are not related to science that have the upper hand. Mm-hmm. So for me, science in these 400 years has taught us many things about how the world really is, but we are not paying attention. It's as if we have a fascination for machines instead of having a fascination for life. We've lost the fascination for life. In fact, we've lost fascination in general. Let me say, Plato and Aristotle is one of the first authors in many scientific disciplines. They disagree in many things, but one thing they agree is that the origin of knowledge is wonder. Taumazein, as they say in Greek. They use the same word. Wonder at the world, wonder at nature. They're saying wow, and they're saying wow at things is what brings you into trying to figure out how they work, what happened there, right? Somehow this sense of wonder has been lost, and the only thing that matters is data. Albert Schweitzer, who was a Peace Nobel Prize, a musician and a doctor theologian, he said at some point that what humanity needs the most, and he says this about 100 years ago, what humanity needs the most is Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben, wonder at life, a sense of awe, of wonder at life. Because if you have this sense of wonder, of awe, then you will respect life. Well, we've lost that. Now we have a sense of wonder at millionaires and at big technological developments and these kind of things. But we're losing our common sense in this sense.
Let me insist on that. It's very interesting what you say, going back to wonder, and it's lost. Now, in order to recover it, because, you know, here the future scientists, we try to make a diagnosis, let's say, and that's why we bring philosophers and historians and scientists, and then kind of, well, I was going to say predict. It's not even that. It's, well, where is this going and where do we want it to go, right? So maybe that can help us some sort of prescriptive ideas. So I must share, every time I hear the word paradigm, I'm like, no, okay, another paradigm. It's like they're always coming, they never arrive. You know, it's like, yeah, the paradigm is like, it's like the same thing for transhumanists. And I'm being a bit ironic here. Like the singularity is near. Well, those of us who are at the other side, it's like, well, the paradigm is right here. But it doesn't really make it in my view. And also the idea of revolution, I think, is a mistaken one, because maybe it's evolution what we did, not revolution, because every time there's a revolution, the system is really good at co-opting it, right? So again, I ask you, but we're thinking together here, really, where to go? You've been on television, you've done really, I must say, amazing things on TV, on public TV. And I try to write articles that go in Spanish and international newspapers to kind of inject these kind of different ways of thinking. It's hard, but it can be done. So where is it? Is it at the political level? Is it lobbying? Is it one person at a time and through WhatsApp? Well, I know you don't use cell phones, but in any case, you know, talking to another person. Is it economics? Is it finding a billionaire that doesn't want to just build rockets, right? Or is it maybe philosophy? I mean, what's really the root from which we can recover this sense of wonder? What do you think?
The route to recover the sense of wonder would be your own personal experience, your own looking at sunrises and sunsets and the eyes of your daughters, at the flowers opening up in spring, at all the wonders of nature. In fact, I believe that contemporary science invites us in many ways to rediscover the sense of wonder. I have a book on the called, in English would be Vital Intelligence, on what we are discovering at the edge of biology. And we realize, for instance, that our bodies, as adult human beings, have about 70 billion cells. And these 70 billion cells are perfectly symphonically coordinated, because otherwise we will be healthy here talking about these things. Now, you may know how difficult it is to coordinate 20 people, 70. 70 billion is about 9,000 times the population of humankind nowadays, right? And this is working symphonically, right? But then each of these cells, or most of them, can be producing with more efficiency than any technology we can imagine, proteins, combining up to a billion molecules to produce up to 10,000 different proteins in a microscopic space, in silence, at room temperature, at ambient temperature, and with the only energy of the metabolism. Now, there is no technology that could do that. And there is no machine that could coordinate 70 billion units. Therefore, our bodies are already a wonder. And this we only know when we go in depth, because when I was studying at high school, cells were factories, mechanically producing things. Well, nowadays we know that all the cells in your organism are different, not just because there are different kinds in your hair, in your teeth, in your eyes, wherever, but in every tissue, but because they're in constant transformation. There are no two identical cells. They're adapting to whatever they have to do at the time. But the question is, who's guiding this? So that's how I come to this idea of, well, there is an intelligence, an implicit intelligence in the body, that the other day I realized, well, it's not like the implicate order that David Bohm was seeing in physics, but in any case, there is something that is not explicit. And some people would say, oh no, the body is guided directly by the brain. But what is the brain made of, if not of cells, right? So, but then in any discipline of science, one experience of mine is sometimes when I've met top scientists in their area, like at Schumacher, where many of them were coming, and you ask them, why is this happening, whatever, in whatever area of science, and they would give you an explanation. But then you ask again, why and why, as if you were a kid asking your mom, right? Why? And then there is always the point in which they'll say, oh, we don't know, right? So in every area of knowledge, the more we know, the more answers we have, the more questions emerge. And this should trigger this sense of wow before the world, as I was saying. But instead of this, instead of using science as a way of awakening wonder and creativity, because creativity requires wonder, we just try to manipulate the data, and it's as if we are hypnotized by this worldview that only wants power and control. And this worldview is in a way suicidal. And David Bohm it was also writing about these things in his days. Is suicidal because it brings to a world that is more and more meaningless. And therefore, it's very urgent to wake up from this kind of slumber in which we are, in which we take the world to be a sum of objects when science shows us it is not, when we take the world to be made of ultimately static entities, when we know that the world is ultimately process, quantum physics shows it, but also we have philosophers like Whitehead and Bergson, and schools like Taoism and Buddhism tell us that the world is impermanent. But now even some physical, scientific, natural science disciplines show it to us. And we need to restore the role of consciousness in everything we do. The whole scientific picture we have of the world doesn't make any sense unless we bring in consciousness, including biological evolution. The standard picture is that you get biological evolution, and then these organisms happen to have consciousness because they sense their environment, and they need to be aware of their environment in order to just to be alive. But consciousness should be there from the beginning. And it doesn't make sense. Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, has a book called Mind and Cosmos, published about 10 years ago, in which he argues this in a very eloquent way, that it doesn't make any sense to speak of biological only evolution, only at a physical biochemical level, and then assume that, oh, consciousness is something that will come out of the blue. Whereas what we know is that cognition is always embedded in life. So we have a very crippled view of evolution.
I appreciate the remark you make and the emphasis on life, because on the one hand, we can go to physics, and we should go to physics and think, what does quantum physics tell us, and what's missing, and so on. We can go all the way to the other side, if you wish, and think about mind and think about consciousness. But in this, it's like this option A or B, and which actually they meet probably, and we may take life for granted, right? It's like, well, living organisms, and as you say, if you look at what not just biology but living systems themselves reveal, it's pretty astonishing. It's pretty astonishing. We still don't know, for instance, about the origin of life, and there's this evolutionary question about whether, I was going to say, people say how minds or consciousness emerged. I would say whether they actually emerged. So this is still very mysterious, even by looking at things that are alive and move.
Well, I would claim, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I would claim that it doesn't make any sense to believe that out of unconscious matter, you can get consciousness. I mean, this is a point that has been made by many philosophers for many decades. It's just two completely different levels. So the only possibility is that consciousness was there from the start. You cannot bring it afterwards.
Okay, let's do some phenomenology there. Maybe for 5 minutes. Help me out, because I agree with you, and if I didn't agree, it wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, agreement is overrated in any case. Yes, you cannot. It's not like emergence in the sense of, well, you get all these insects doing something or the flock of birds. It's not that kind of emergence what we're talking about. So I also see it as an impossible miracle. Now there's the phenomenological view that says, well, here now I am conscious, and trying to pretend that there wasn't and then there was. It just violates the fact that here now that's the only thing not only I can be sure of, but that I really have, if I can put it this way. But then there is the chronological view, which is what I'm now reviewing another book on consciousness. I won't say who wrote it, but they all play the same trick. So help me out. They say, well, brains are important, so they take a bit of neuroscience and a bit of evolution. They call themselves evolutionists. So they take brain and then check it with evolution and say, well, look, if we play the tape back, it must have emerged. If you protest, they then say, well, so let's imagine a time on Earth when there were only rocks. And so can you conceive that? And we now know, because of cosmology and so on, that there was a time, that's chronology, right? Chronological. There was a time when there were no living organisms. And so it must have emerged. That's what they would say. And so in a way they have a point, but still they cannot make it work. So how do we get out of this? Because at the end, let me just add one more thing. I've sensed this is now a matter of temperament, which I also want to talk about to you. It's about the predispositions that we all have. I know I'm more like a romantic, and I don't particularly enjoy machines, but I have friends who really want to open things up. And so if you have that way of being, let's say, you're more likely to fall for one philosophical position or another. So how to resolve this tension between proper phenomenology and the chronological argument?
Well, the chronological argument is something that emerges in our consciousness and in our here and now, right? All views of the past emerge in the present. There is an article by Stephen Hawking and a physicist called Hertog, H-E-R-T-O-G, about 10 years ago or something, that was claiming that we can create multiple pasts from every present. As long as they fit our data, you can extend pasts wherever you go. But the point was that there is no single real objective past, because another assumption of the Cartesian worldview was that the world is something objective out there, and you are a passive spectator here that, as a photographic camera would do, is passively recording this objective separate thing. What we know nowadays is that this is not the world. The world is something much more participatory. We are not just passive spectators, but co-creative participants in a world of relations. And therefore, the idea that there is a past that is 100% cast in stone belongs to this Cartesian paradigm. I would say that instead of truth being cast in stone, as in the Cartesian paradigm, truth is something not so much like stone, but like a rainbow-like. Rainbow is something that always involves your participation. It's an observer. And if you move, you're going by car, the rainbow is following you, right? Because it's relational. The stone too, but it's not so obvious. So I like this idea of truth being more rainbow-like than stone-like, not so much cast in stone, but cast in a rainbow. We have nowadays this kind of a dogmatic belief, because it's mostly a belief, that matter is more important than consciousness. There is no scientific proof of that. It's a philosophical choice. In the same way that the scientists that deny the existence of consciousness, they're doing that from a metaphysical choice. Whereas for most philosophies and more wisdom traditions of humankind everywhere, consciousness has always been primary and matter secondary. That happens in the East, in the West, everywhere, right? And yeah, in the 20th century, you get these two physicists, these two people that got the Nobel Prize in Physics, Schrödinger and Eugene Wigner, both of whom claim at some point in their works that there are experiments, or there are situations in quantum physics that show that the only way of understanding them is to realize that the world is not ultimately made of matter and energy, but of consciousness and perception. This is Schrödinger and Wigner. The world is made of consciousness and perception rather than matter and energy. But when we have this chronological perspective, we assume that, no matter was there first. Now, if you assume that consciousness is there from the start, because you always need to have an observer for everything you observe. So these rocks that are from 4,000 years ago can be interpreted in other ways. And of course, the view of the Big Bang as something objective that out of the blue, out of nothing, without no cause, which is something completely unscientific, emerged 13.8 billion years ago, also gets into question.
Yes, yes. I see that. Yes. So interesting, because the world out there part, let's say the spatial part, I think I can grasp why it is fallacious, right? Like the world out there. But now you're talking also about time. It's like the time long gone. And it's another kind of trick that we've inherited. And that seems to be what causes this paradox in trying to think, well, I'm now conscious. I know I will die. I know there wasn't people before me. So if I imagine that time now gone, it must have emerged somehow. I mean, I'm insisting because look, I have one foot on each side. I work in a more orthodox environment, let's say, of thinking, and I'm working on the heterodox, sometimes heretic side. But now Jordi, I'm trying to do this movement of, well, can I go backwards and maybe understand even better, like straw man, that's the verb that's used in English sometimes, like make the best possible case for those that disagree with my position. So when we say consciousness is fundamental, consciousness first and all that, I mean, I would suppose many of the ones who are listening would say yes. Now I would ask from a scientific point of view, or even philosophical, what work does that do for us? And you mentioned interpretation, right? Then you can interpret the world in a different sense. And maybe that I want to talk about that too with you, because that's more a humanistic touch on things. And I want to talk about joy versus alienation and anxiety and so on. But before that, what does it do in terms of explanation? Like if those guys, lovely fellow of us, want to explain consciousness in terms of brain, if we take consciousness first, can we explain brain or matter or the structure of things in terms of consciousness? I mean, we should be able to offer also something in return for that really expensive but important move.
And this is the part of the work of bringing forth this paradigm. And by the way, when you were saying that the paradigm is not happening and so on, let's remember that historically, all paradigms take a long time, take generations. So maybe we were a bit optimistic when in the late 20th century, we saw the new paradigm just so close, right? The emergence of the Descartes, Galileo, Newton paradigm took 200 years, right? So maybe things take time. And before they triumph, there is usually the last effort of the other side to hold to its ground, which is probably what we are seeing now. It's like right now, we are seeing the last effort of the mechanistic paradigm to hold sway. And with all these transhumanist dreams and with all idea of artificial intelligence, which for me is a fiction, it's just an imitation of intelligence. It's not true intelligence because machines don't understand anything and therefore is not intelligent. If you put something in the Google Translator, even if it were to translate it correctly, it doesn't understand what it's translating. There is no understanding there. Intelligence is always in living beings. And what we call artificial intelligence should be called something like algorithmic calculus or something like this, but it's not real intelligence. Well, but there is this fascination with this, and this is really spreading everywhere and having more and more power. But I think it's like the swan song of this mechanistic paradigm that is doing its last effort to try to control life. And if we can resist and keep seeing the light and keep feeling life and keep realizing that life cannot be reduced to anything mechanical and keep listening to our heart. Before you were asking me about truth, Gandhi was saying that the truth is exactly what your heart tells you. Just that, except that you need to learn to listen to your heart. But he says, well, once you've learned to listen to your heart, that's the truth, right? Not what the experts say, and so on. So yes, the paradigm may take its time, but I trust that because it's much more congenial with life, with nature, and with ultimate reality of things, And the other paradigm, the mechanistic paradigm, it's ultimately a delusion. That's why I'm pretty sure that this paradigm will eventually have the upper hand. We will eventually, have the day.
Yes, the question is if it will do it soon enough, right?
That's another question, because in the meantime, surely we are polluting the world. We are creating more and more dismal conditions of life for more and more people. And we are, the chaos is spreading. It's as if at the very same time, I've been saying this for many years actually now, I see the light increasing and also the darkness increasing. And you cannot tell which is the one who is going to win, like in a good movie, right? If you know that the light is going to win, is too easy. And I sometimes say that if before being born, you had been asked, you had asked to incarnate in a world that would be very interesting, you wouldn't have been sent to the Middle Ages or to a very stable world, but you would have been sent to the early 21st century, where everything is so dynamic and so chaotic that the effects of your work can have much more repercussion than in a very stable society, and everything has to change. And probably what you learned at university doesn't work anymore. So this is a world that is more of an adventure to be in.
Yes,
and
I like how you put it this way. It's interesting. There seem to be cycles to this chaos and order throughout history, and also throughout our lives, for sure. And it's not comfortable, but when it happens, it's very interesting what opens as a possibility to take place.
Let me bring another subject. I just was reminded of David Pitt's work with Indigenous Knowledge. Like he has this book on Blackfoot physics. Of course, in indigenous traditions, and there are still nowadays about 5,000 indigenous traditions in our world. It's not just people from the past. In these traditions, consciousness is primary, and they have these rocks they would see as incarnations of spirits or whatever it is. They wouldn't see the rocks just as in terms of chemistry. They would see something else in the rock. They would see a soul, and why shouldn't be anything like that? Why should it be that all these cultures were wrong and we, the mechanistic, technological, contemporary people, are the only ones that see things as they are? Yes. And if we see things as they are, how is it that our world is not working? It's getting worse and worse.
Yes. In a way, we in the West proclaim the only myth that pretends it's not a myth. And I mean myth in a good sense, right? Not just a story, blah, blah, blah. It's like this myth of the science as we practice it, as if it was. That's why, by the way, it was confusing how we started. I mean, at the same time enlightening, because you were making this, let me come back to this. You were making this distinction between facts and fiction as something that has been lost. At the same time, the arbiter of that distinction, or even the possibility of making that distinction, is very dangerous, because who says what's a fact? Okay. And actually, I don't think that facts exist as such. Yes. And here I'm with Bruno Latour, who recently passed away, and his work that hasn't made it to scientists, of course. This idea, and I'm not a total constructivist, but this idea that because everything is relational, even a measurement of an electron colliding with another electron, it's this big affordance of the human technology, our beliefs, of course, the laws of physics, and so on. So let's go back to this distinction between facts and fiction, now that you mentioned indigenous knowledge.
Very good point, because certainly facts don't exist as objective, separate things out there. They always exist in relation. For instance, in relation to an observer, which means that truths can be plural. And when I was saying this idea of Gandhi, that truth is what your heart tells you, your truth may be different from mine. But also truth expressed in English, in German, in Catalan, in Chinese, or whatever, may sound different and have different nuances. So it's not this, there is no single fixed way of establishing this truth. So for me, again, the point is to move from the mechanical objective view to the relational view. If you see truth in terms of relation, truth is what makes sense to you here and now.
Yes, yes. Thank you for
And
that.
and obviously there are things that right now make sense to you and others that don't.
Yeah.
Like we are having a conversation is perfectly true.
Hmm.
So this is the way of escaping the situation from above, going up, expanding consciousness. But the other way is going down and is just creating a blur of confusion, and that's post-truth. So post-truth realizes, fits with the idea that there are not objective facts and objective lies, but not to bring you to a higher state of consciousness, so to speak, to a higher perception, to a more holistic understanding of life, but to reduce you to a lost citizen that will have as his only choice to listen to what the power says, the government or whoever.
Thank you for that. Two very interesting points that I now have the insight for the first time because of what you said. First is if we take facts and crank the volume too much in excess, we get this kind of scientism. If we turn it down in defect, then we get post-truth. And interestingly enough, scientism and post-truth seem to enjoy their company because
exactly, yes, and both are very popular.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
But both are dehumanizing, and both tend to alienate us from nature and from meaning.
Yes, yes. Great. And the other thing that you made me realize is that when you said that facts are always exist in relationship to an observer, is that this kind of alchemical formula brings us directly to pluralism, which is so needed. It's not just holism, it's this difficult idea to conceive that there are really different ways to even not only talking about truth, but different ways of something being true. And we desperately need that intuition. And it's very not comforting, it's very healing, you know, like I can breathe better if I realize for a moment that may be the case. It's not a war. It's not a war anymore.
There is a traditional idea that we are all microcosms of the macrocosm. And in that sense, well, to put it in terms of David Bohm, the universe is enfolded in each of us. And each of every human being or every sentient being is an enfoldment of the whole universe, which is a modern way of speaking about what was before called a microcosm. Yeah. But then this implies both this holism, because things are undivided wholes, but these wholes are always reflected through specific places or prisms, and every time they get an accent, a nuance, yes. A context, yes, which is different. But that's life, in contrast to machines, which are always the same.
Let's talk a bit about are they human emotions, human tones, if we use a musical analogy, human scales or tones? Because in your books, you write about very humanistic aspects, like the anxiety we have, the alienation, and you contrast it with joy and other aspects of being a human. And this is not about feeling good or even feeling better, but going back to also Orwell and map a little bit how you see this critique of yours, which I think it's high resolution as to our malaise. We can talk about science or civilization, but our daily lives, I mean, I'm anxious. I'm generally happy, but I'm anxious and perhaps alienated at times. There's something running through each of us that it's dark.
Well, one thing we need is to come to our senses. More and more, we live lives mediated by technology and mediated by abstractions. And abstractions and technology are very useful as long as you can use them as tools. But if they flood your world, your experience, you get lost, because meaning is always found in the here and now, in feeling your body, in feeling your relations, in feeling your heart, in feeling your insights. If you just rely on external things, you get lost. A silly example that I was told is that someone can be sitting in an office next to a window and be asked, is it raining? And the person, instead of looking through the window, would look at the computer and the computer would say, not raining. But then you would see that the drops are falling behind him. This has happened, they tell me. I suppose happens in many places, because we believe more the abstraction than the real thing. And of course, this is alienating. So we come to this place in which we have more knowledge than ever. We have more material possibilities than ever, but in many cases, we are also more lost than ever. On the other hand, we are lucky to have this variety of choice in the access to knowledge that our ancestors didn't have 100 years ago, for instance, right? Like we can, through the internet, you can get scientific articles with one click. It's amazing, right? I had to queue at the university for weeks to get a scientific article 30 years ago. Now you get this, but you also get access to very good translations of wisdom traditions from everywhere. So we have all these possibilities, but then in many cases, what the end result of this is more and more people are being alienated. And for instance, one of the promises of technology is liberating time so that robots will do the work and we will have lots of leisure. But what would most people use that leisure for? Apparently to play with video games. Now, what is that? I mean, in the Renaissance, if people would have had leisure, you can imagine that they would have devoted themselves to painting, to music, to architecture, to sculpture, to poetry. Yes. But we are more and more addicted to what these technologies offer us. And actually, no wonder, because they are from the start designed to be addictive, as we know. Yes. So all these things come together to create a situation in which we have more possibilities than ever, certainly than our ancestors, but we also have more challenges. And it's like we have to navigate with harsher winds. And when you navigate with harsh wind, you can get faster, but you can also drown. So yeah, it's good to have a good sense of where we are going in this navigation. Yes. And to avoid all the sirens and all the Silang Charybdis that we can find on the way.
Thank you for this metaphor, because it's not machine-like. You can imagine you're a bird. Yeah, we need some of this thinking. Yes, indeed.
Well, I mean, for one of my conclusions is that the world responds more to the language of imagination, intuition, and creativity than to the language of laws, formulas, and concepts. They are very useful, but poets go farther than scientists in reaching the core of reality. Poets and wise people in general.
Will the future scientist be a poet? I often wonder that.
Well, I think the future scientist should be more of a poet than most scientists are nowadays. I mean, should be more human, and in being more human, should have a creative dimension, should be aware of the consciousness dimension. I would imagine the future scientist would be practicing meditation to be more in touch with him or herself and with the world, would be more aware of the whole, would have more wonder, more sense of wonder at the world, would be less interested in power and control. I'm saying I'm doing the prescriptive task. Yes. You were asking. Yes. I hope that's what the future scientists should be, because what we find nowadays is that we get great specialists in narrow areas that hardly know anything outside their area, and this is not what a fully human being should be. Up to the time of Goethe, we had people that were aware of all the areas of knowledge of the time. People like Alexander von Humboldt and Goethe knew everything that was published in all kinds of scientific disciplines, and also in the humanities. At the time it was possible. Now knowledge has exploded in all these fragments, and we fragmented knowledge also in the sense that we only look at the crumbles, data. Like data is the purest form of knowledge. If you put together data in a coherent way, you would have information. If you put information together in a coherent way, then you would have knowledge, as the knowledge of the scientific disciplines. And if you put together different kinds of knowledge in a coherent way, you would have wisdom. But nowadays, wisdom is a word that seems to have vanished from our vocabulary, and we only speak of data.
They were truly geniuses, and of course they knew everything, and they didn't split it into fragments. Now everything has grown in terms of what needs to be known. Do you think they could know everything today?
Well, you cannot possibly today, because it's like we've gone too far, and this going too far is part of a fragmentation of knowledge that is reflected in a fragmentation of society and fragmentation of people. So when you were speaking about Malays and so on, a part of what happens is that we often feel fragmented people. Yeah. But no wonder when you have a fragmented knowledge, instead of having and what we mostly lack is, I suppose, a coherent worldview. Yeah. If you have a coherent worldview, then you can have branches extending into several disciplines. That's fine. But we don't know everything that science tells us. Science has replaced philosophy and spirituality, apparently, as the core explanation of everything. And it can give us very good explanations about material things, surely. But as to what is the meaning of life, of your specific life, as to what is a good society, as to what is a good work of art, doesn't tell us absolutely anything. So, of course, physics and biology and psychology are great, but we also need another kind of knowledge that answers the more deeply human questions. And this is completely eclipsed.
Yeah. Now, let me wrap up, because the hour has gone by so quickly, by asking, this may feel out of the blue, but I want to end up talking about Raimon Panikkar, who was your supervisor, as I understand.
No, more like the subject of my dissertation, except that I worked with him for 2 years as I was preparing for this dissertation, so I both knew the person and his work.
So I admire him greatly. I think he has a PhD in chemistry, maybe another one in philosophy, and another one in theology, right?
And one in chemistry, yes.
Yes.
3, yes.
Now, and he was he? Let me ask you, because you know much more about him. Was he embodying, in a way, what we're prescribing today? And he passed away. What would he say about the future scientist? He was a wise man, no doubt, and so knowledgeable.
Now, he wasn't mainly a scientist. He had this PhD in chemistry, but he didn't develop that. I mean, in his late 20s, he published articles on quantum physics. So he knew enough as to publish articles on this, and popularizing articles, so to speak. And he had always an interest in science. And of course, for me, philosophy doesn't make any sense if it doesn't look at science. In the same way that science doesn't make much sense if it doesn't take into account a wider picture. Panikkar was also an example of pluralism, in the sense that he could give lectures in 6 languages. And he claimed to be at the same time a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, and a secular person in the sense of someone, contemporary person that doesn't require spiritual tradition to understand the world, because he could see the world in scientific terms. So he embodied this pluralism, and he was quite a complete person in that sense. And certainly he had this quality of wisdom that I hope the future scientists should have too. And by the way, you seem to be on the way to embody the future scientist, now that I think of it, in your own life, the path, the way you're going.
Okay. Well, let's stop here, not because of what you said, but because I want time for the rest of the participants to comment. And let me say, Jordi, the future scientist was born with the intention, regardless of the content, that the format was such that it wasn't an interview, it wasn't Q&A, it was a dialogue. I like also conversation, because I like this idea of the verse, something that, like a dance, where from time to time there'll be these openings in between what you're saying and what I'm saying, that the third thing emerged. In Spanish we have eso, no? Esto, eso y aquello. And this has happened sometimes today, and it doesn't always happen. And so at least myself, I've had some intuitions that I didn't have before, and it's because I was talking to you. So I'm really thankful. Thank you.
And so am I. Thank you.
All right, James. So we open it up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for this interesting conversation in this past hour. So yes, so we can open it up to for the for Q&A and discussion. To ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen under reactions, or write your question in the chat. But before that, I would like to use my privileged position as host to ask a question myself. And it's a question for both of you, really, which is, will the future scientists find any work? Because you know, from all this discussion you've been having about the paradigms and all the prescriptions you've been having, and also it sort of reminded me as well of when we had Rupert Sheldrake over during the Future Scientists, where I think, Alex, you asked something along the lines of, what would you recommend to the next future scientists to get to that position? And you said, well, a trust fund is good, or something along those lines. You know, if you've got money, do it. If not, you know, it's going to be very difficult. So with everything you've been saying about paradigms and revolutions and counter-revolutions of the system, it seems to me it's more of a systemic problem rather than an individual. How would you respond to that?
Well, shall I go?
Yes.
In the long term, I would say that we either have a decent, sane world, which would be very happy to employ this kind of future scientist, or we have no world at all, because we just destroy life and destroy society, which is one of the possible paths at this stage. So in that sense, in the long term, I would say that the only scientist would be this kind of scientist. In the short term is another matter. So if someone is here in his or her early 20s and is wondering, well, you need to navigate the rough waters in which we are. And of course, try to find a way of life that allows you to get through, but without betraying your deeper values. Because if you sell your deeper values for money, then you're completely lost. But that often requires having at least one foot outside the system. And many of us, I suppose, and many of us listening to this conversation probably have had or have a foot outside the system. I do, in a way. But well, that's the part of the dance we have to be doing.
Always James's questions are the easiest to answer. Well, negatively, I would add that, yeah, I don't think things are going very well, because, well, science is a career, but it's many other things. So of course, the where you see it happening the most is in academia through paid grants and within that system. And this is also a blessing, because that's the way I myself, for instance, can be a scientist. But I've also been lucky, you know, talking about one foot on each side. Well, if you know, it's hard to find where to place your foot, and it's hard to play with.
Oh, I think
Alex?
I think we lost Alex for a moment.
Yes, Alex, hello. Well, yeah.
I hope he comes back, but thank you anyway, both of you, for your answer. Thank you. Yeah, so next let's go to Mary.
This may seem like a very simple question or childish question, but you know, someone said, well, there's far too much to know, of course, and we know that. So what would we say we need to know? You know, out of all that's possible, what are the things we need to know? We need to be teaching our children, you know, as a teacher and a person interested in science and the arts. You know, how do you see what we absolutely need to know?
Yeah, simple questions are often the most important ones and the most relevant ones. So as for children, yeah, I feel many people feel that most of what they have in the current curriculum is not really useful for their lives. And I imagine they would have to be taught anything that fosters their sense of wonder, anything that fosters their creativity. Go back to education in the etymological sense of bringing out what every child has inside him or her. But also there are very basic things that I think we should teach, like breathing. In yoga, in Taoism and so on, breathing is very important. And we don't teach it. Yoga, for instance, or anything similar. Mindfulness, what we call mindfulness, is something that should be taught. And dealing with life. So and I would imagine education should be not always indoors behind the walls and so on, but it should be more outside and should be more participatory. And then, of course, within this framework I'm describing, there could be many possible ways, but certainly less intellectual learning and memorizing and so on, and more things that are embodied and that are related to making children feel fully alive. Because often what education does is the contrary, is deadening. The sense of wonder of children when they enter primary school, when they exit high school, often is lost. And it should be the other way around.
So I've always worked in progressive schools, and exactly the things you have described are what, we try to help our children with. But then how do we get our larger education system, just as you said, in science and all these places, to recognize what kind of different human being this creates?
Well, this is more of a political task, and of course, meetings, conversations like this one, and anything we can do to spread the word about these things would help. And more, I mean, my conviction is that when something is true, eventually it should reach people. So people will eventually come to realize this. As Alex was saying, the problem is if it will be too late or not too late. But let's do what we can to spread that the purpose of education should be to create fully human beings and not cogs for the big machine of the economic system. Because the main purpose of a human life is to discover who you are and to self-actualize, to bring forth as much as you can who you truly are. And education should be focused on that. Every person is unique and unrepeatable. And we should focus on this rather than trying to just to create the new workforce that be delivering the parcels of Amazon and reading barcodes in a supermarket, which is what most people are trying to do nowadays. But yeah, thank you. We need to go in that direction. Sure.
I didn't hear the question, but I can intuit it from the answer Jordi was giving. Sorry, I went out and I'm back. Maybe I can reply to this one and the previous one by saying this double way. One way, I think, talking about education, but also about whether future scientists will be unemployed. One way is being strategic, right? Like trying to be clever and see if that's the system, how can you dance with it? How can you be in it without belonging to it? I must confess that's what I've been doing over the last years, right? And you need to, in a way, get involved, get a bit wet, but always remember, it's like when in this movie Inception, when they have this totem, you always look at the totem and say, but that's not, I mean, I cannot forget to get back, because it's easy to forget, especially when you're, because it's like a ritual. You're playing those habits, right? You're writing those grants that make you think in a way. You are in these committees, So if you play too much, you become, let me put it this way, one of them you forget. So that's the strategic way. And that applies also to jobs and finding your way through within academia, without. But then there's another way, which is more based on trust. And Jordi has spoken a lot about life, and life finds her way through. And that's her job, right? And it's creative in doing it. So if we can tune to that stream, then we will, you know, it's like with a river. Hopefully things will happen and it will help us. So it's a combination of both, I think, to try to make it happen and also to trust that it will happen. And then we'll see, and then we will see.
Thank you, Mary, for coming in. Next, I'd like to a question coming from the chat, which is specifically for Jordi, which is how much has the French philosopher Marcel Foucault, with his supposition that there are no truths except those promoted by those with power, influenced Western academics? He is considered by some the godfather of Western academics.
Well, Foucault is not a philosopher I've read much, but certainly he has something to do with this wave of postmodernism, in which, that for me is like a precursor of post-truth. So Foucault is very interesting in his analysis of power and his dismantling the way power works and has been working historically, and especially through institutions like prisons and surveillance and all the rest of it. And in that sense, some of his ideas are relevant today, except that I like more, for instance, the way they are developed by someone like the Italian Giorgio Agamben, that has been very influenced by Foucault, but for me is much more to the point for the times we are living. But then, yes, along with not just Foucault, but many of the French philosophers of his generation, there is this sense of in which they somehow went too far in opposing a monolithic truth that had been the sort of standard truth of Western patriarchal identity. In opposing it, which to some extent was right to do, they went to the other extreme and ended up smashing all sense of reference. Whereas if we are in France, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, somehow 1 or 2 generations younger than Foucault, is someone who developed a phenomenology that is very much based on a relational sense of truth in the way I was trying to convey, and very much based on the experience of the body, of perception, and of this coming to our senses that I've also been defending here. So Merleau-Ponty is a very good starting point to come back to our senses.
Sorry, Alex, were you going to say something, or?
I'm tempted, but I'm tempted. I just love the French and the philosophy they put forth. And I think despite some overshooting, what Jordi is saying, we need this pluralism. Otherwise, what we're left here is the Anglo-American analytic, anti-metaphysical gig. And that's terrible. That's really terrible. And so, yes, you know, you have flavors, Foucault, but you have Gilles Deleuze and you have Henri Bergson. And this continental way of thinking is a world heritage, I think. And also we have the Germans, but that's downplayed. So in this symphony where we're trying to, you know, restore different voices, we need the continentals back. That's how much they really are in sync with the Eastern traditions in a way. And I'm not an expert at all, but they resonate with those tones. And so they're badly needed because they're indigenous to us, the Westerners, right? When we speak about indigenous knowledge, well, I'm also from a place, you see, that's why I was asking about Panikkar, that Catalan, like Jordi and I. Well, we also have indigenous knowledge here in Europe. Sometimes we forget. So we can go and find it. And so the French are a good source of that, despite their mistakes, you could say, yeah.
Great, thank you. Next, let's go to Michael.
Hey, thanks so much. This is really great. So I guess I have a question regarding truth from the perspective of beauty, kind of like Gadamer. Gadamer has an interpretation of Plato where there's an aesthetic sense of truth and there's a practicality to the arts in that if you develop this aesthetic sensibility or sense of beauty, that can also be, one way to interpret it is that can also be a way to appreciate or recognize truth. Because from a classical sense, from what I gather at least, is that truth reveals herself through beauty, would be one way to look at it.
Right.
So, and that's also tied with rain and the Romantic poets and some interpretations. So for me, you kind of have this wave or this lineage that you can almost trace back to Plato. And if you go poetically, you could even, from a poetic sense, you could even go back to Egypt if you look at some more recent translations of pyramid texts and things. So what about the role of beauty and aesthetics? And I do feel like this would transform the modern notion of a scientist,
Right.
where you might not recognize them as an artist, right? A scientific artist of sorts or something. Thinking out loud.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Well, of course, there is these famous lines by John Keats. Truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all you know and all you need to know. I seem to remember that's the wording, right? And that says it all, right? But then if you go further back, in Plato, for instance, and in many branches of classical philosophy, Western and Eastern, truth, beauty, and goodness go always together. So we were talking about the fragmentation of our culture, and one thing that has also been fragmented is to pretend that truth goes one way, beauty goes another way. And actually, we get to a place in which we lose all sense of goodness, then we lose all sense of beauty, and we claim, oh, everything is beautiful, it just depends on what you like. And then eventually we lose also a sense of truth. So these three things that were together, they were split, and now they are disappearing more and more. But then when you were talking about this in relation to the future scientists, for me it's very interesting how all big scientific breakthroughs happen through insight. I mean, everything. I mean, normal science is done in a sort of methodical way. Very good. But every big discovery comes out of dreams. There are many big discoveries out of dreams. Out of Poincaré, the mathematician jumping into a bus and realizing, oh, of course, it's this. Or Archimedes saying Eureka in the bathtub. And basically, every big advancement of knowledge happens through insight. And insight is something that is always related somehow to art and creativity and beauty. So mechanical science, gathering data and chunking them and ordering and so on, yeah, for day-to-day, yes. But when you need to discover something, you need this other dimension. And then the future scientists, yes, would have a sense of beauty and would have and also would have to have a sense of goodness if these things go together. So would be a creative person and a good person. Most scientists I know are good persons, but I also know that there are millions of scientists working directly towards the destruction of humankind or the destruction of human dignity. So this is part of our scene.
I mean, it's interesting because I had a group discussion, quantum and consciousness, of retired professors, and I was by far the youngest. And there was one guy in his 80s who's a physicist, and someone was talking about art. And Gordon came out with, you know, basically, good God, man, I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. So there's like an artistic aesthetic, even in serious science with someone like him, but it's not necessarily talked about a whole lot.
Right. Yeah. But Alex, do you want to say something?
Underplayed.
Yes, I do. It's gonna sound like a joke, but I think it summarizes a point that came to mind. I think the future scientists will be invited to cool parties. Let me explain why. Let me explain why. I have this friend. And Jordi, you know him from Valencia, an author, a writer from Valencia. He's called Juan Arnau. He's a good friend of mine, and we often discuss about this. And I think I'm not sure if I mentioned this in another Future Scientist, so if I have, forgive me, but it's worth repeating. We can put forth metaphysical arguments for and against what I call the unholy trinity of materialism, reductionism, and mechanicism. We can put forth epistemological arguments, political, sociological, economical, but the aesthetic argument is demolishing. And you know, Juan was telling me in these parties, if you invite a scientist, let's imagine, that sounds like a joke. Let's imagine there's a cool party, and it's not just like, let's say, a party amongst poets and so on, or it could be also politicians, or it could be, and you want to have a cool conversation with somebody, and there's this scientist, and he or she is interesting, I would say, for a while, short while. Why? Okay, tell us about the brain. Oh, the receptors, blah, blah, blah. You know, of course, consciousness is nothing but this. So you spend some time, but then I would say you realize that their worldview is ugly. It's ugly. I mean, maybe they also dressed in an ugly way, and you know, cities are ugly. So they're good hints of what's going on, right? Beauty is a good hint. Now, their whole worldview, when you see it unfold, it is ugly. So it's not aesthetically very sophisticated and you know, insightful and so on, like a big machine, you know. So after 10 minutes, you just look for a musician or for a poet or somebody more interesting to talk. So the beauty argument is very important, I think.
It's also interesting what you're mentioning, Alex, in that I feel like with some of the people that I've met like that, and I've fallen into that trap too, is it's almost like there's a construct in their head and they're not necessarily present with what's with the conversation itself. They're kind of referencing the storehouse of knowledge or information.
Yes.
And even if you don't get bored with it's like when they've drained that, they don't have anything else left to talk about on a basic human level, like, hey, I saw this squirrel yesterday, or I mean, as ridiculous as that might sound.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So fascinating. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for coming in. So I don't see any more hands up for the moment, hopefully.
And there's one hand up, but I think
Valjean
yes,
has a hand up. Yes.
Sorry, Valjean, I didn't see you.
a real hand up, not an icon hand up. Very good.
Yes.
Yes.
I just enjoyed the wonderful balance you had between light and darkness, and you know, despair and hope for the future. But I want to give you a wow experience, and it happens every fall in the cellar of this house where I'm living, and hundreds of small ladybugs get into the cellar. And of course, you don't kill ladybugs. I have a different feeling about a mosquito, but a ladybug I'm quite reverent about. So I carefully put them all back outside. And I'm beginning to think that I must do something else. But one other really wow experience was that I went out early in the morning when I was back in the States for a short time on the campus of a small college. And I went out, and all the trees were a vibrant color. And as I went closer, the monarch butterfly migration took off from that campus. So I immediately rushed back to the house. There were no telephones, cell phones in those days, and called the newspapers, and they came out and they stayed. And eventually, of course, they took off, and I just learned that migration goes about 3,000 miles, and that they come back, and they don't always choose beautiful places along the Atlantic coastline. They sometimes end up in a garage in Cleveland, Ohio for a break. I remember this terrible feeling of sadness I had the next day walking on the beach when one small monarch butterfly was flying around. I thought, you missed it. You missed going with them. What was more generated last night of the wow experience when they studied insects. This program, of course, talked about the sounds that animals make, to the mother, making a cry to her child, or the baby, deer crying, and the mother interprets it. So that was understandable. The microphones they put out, they had imitated all these calls, but then they went down to the very low level of insects and studied how the smallest insect communicates. And they were able to get the sound of a caterpillar. And, there were two of them on the leaf. And I suppose the fellow who was describing this said, maybe one was telling the other, hey, there's better stuff on this side of the leaf than the side you're on. But it just reminded me that there are some people who spend 20 and 30 years of their life studying how insects communicate with each other. And it was a wow experience to me. And as was this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Insects certainly are a source of these wow experiences. But now that you were mentioning monarch butterflies, another amazing thing is that these butterflies that gather once a year in a valley in Mexico,
yeah,
they start their journey from Canada and the northern United States. And how do they know they have to start flying to meet at this time in this valley of Mexico? But then another amazing thing, butterflies have a very short lifespan. So the butterflies that start the journey are not the ones that arrive. And of course, they've never been there. The ones that have been there the last time were like the great grandmothers.
yeah.
So how on earth do they know that? So the only way to understand this is to assume that there is a kind of collective intelligence guiding them. And what do we know about that? We know nothing, and we are locked in our individual mechanistic mindsets.
Yeah.
So yeah, certainly this is a source of wow.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Baljean. So at this point then, as we're sort of reaching the end of this session, I'd like to come back to both of you and see if you have any final words to leave us with today.
That's always hard. Well, I can say that we're reaching the end of the year, and the Future Scientist has walked some way. We have one more with Shantena Sabadini next month, and then we'll announce something as to how we continue this. But it's been really a blessing to share this. Not only, in a way, we are pretending and taking seriously that we are having a conversation and nobody's watching, but there's something different about having people watching at the same time and then asking questions. So, well, talking about lights and shadows, the pandemic brought a lot of darkness, but it also brought us Zoom. If we don't overuse it, it can be a blessing, and that's a good example today that we can do that. But I also hope we go back to in-person events. I haven't met Jordi in person, for instance, right? So I hope we can see each other at our eyes and not trying to, well, where's the camera? It's here. Oh, where is it?
Thank you, Alex. Well, for me, it has been a pleasure to spend this time with all of you. I actually look forward, when this finishes, to look all the messages that are in the chat. I can see there are many of them. So I certainly want to read what is there. And yes, I hope we move towards this model of future scientist and more full human person that we've been describing here. And thank you, Paris Center, for your work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for today. It really has been a really thrilling conversation. And of course, thank you for everyone joining us today. Thank you all for those wonderful messages in the chat about this session, and for everyone who contributed. Before we go, as you may know, I'd just like to invite you to the upcoming sessions. We do have the ongoing series Recovering the Sacred going on at the moment, which is on weekends. This weekend we have David Lorimer talking about recovering a sense of the sacred, an evolutionary imperative. And on Sunday we will have Jeremy Lent talking about weaving a web of meaning, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays a path to sustainable flourishings. We have also past sessions available on our website if you want to have a look at those. But until then, thank you again so much. Alex and Jordi, and we'll see you again soon here at the Power Center.
Thank you.
Gracias. Gracias, Jordi.